Chapter 9 Solomon Northup is My Name. Unknown to Solomon Northup and Samuel Bass, their letter-writing campaign had gone better, although much slower than they believed. Bass had expected that the letters he had written would take 2 weeks, perhaps a little longer, to travel 1,500 miles between Marksville, Louisiana, and Saratoga Springs, New York. Actually, both towns were off the beaten path, and so the letters Bass mailed from the Marksville post office on August 15, 1852, didn't reach Saratoga Springs for nearly a month. What became of the letter to Judge Marvin is unknown, but the letter addressed jointly to William Perry and Cephas Parker arrived safely. However, the two store owners were reluctant to become involved in such a complex and dangerous enterprise as rescuing Solomon from slavery. They forwarded the letter to Solomon's wife, Anne, who ran the kitchen at Carpenter's Hotel in Glens Falls, New York. Anne and all 3 of the children, including married daughter Margaret, now lived in this town near Saratoga Springs. When Anne saw the letter from her husband, she was beside herself with excitement, as were Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo. Since John Manning's letter had arrived 12 years earlier, and Clem Ray had visited them a little later, Solomon's family had not heard anything whatsoever about his whereabouts. Now, out of the blue, came the news. Solomon was alive and enslaved somewhere along Bayou Beth, in the vicinity of Marksville, Louisiana. Although that encompassed a large region with thousands of slaves, it was a start toward finding him. To this day, several questions remain about the letter that Perry and Parker forwarded to Anne Northup. First, why didn't Solomon ask Bass to write to Anne to begin with, instead of the two white store owners? One possibility is that Solomon was afraid that Anne would come down to Louisiana to try to free him, which might have resulted in her being kidnapped into slavery too. Another puzzle is why didn't Bass mention in the letter that Edwin Epps owned Solomon? That would have made locating Solomon much easier. Perhaps Bass and Solomon were concerned that if Epps found out about the letter and saw that he was mentioned as owner of a kidnapped black man, he would sell Solomon rather than free him. Solomon might wind up in some remote place where rescuing him was impossible. Finally, why didn't Anne write back informing her husband that she had gotten the letter and was trying to free him? Anne may have been afraid that her letter would be intercepted and shown to Solomon's owner, who would punish him for it. Anne took the letter to the nearby village of Sandy Hill, now Hudson Falls, New York, and showed it to Henry B. Northup, the attorney whose family had once owned several of Solomon's ancestors and who had received the first letter. Henry B. looked into the matter and discovered an act to protect the free citizens of this state from being kidnapped or reduced to slavery. Henry B. Northup assembled documents proving that Solomon was a free black man. These included several affidavits, sworn written statements, from prominent citizens stating that Solomon had been free all his life until his kidnapping. Henry B. also asked Anne to write a memorial or appeal to Governor Washington Hunt, verifying that Solomon was a free citizen of New York and describing their marriage, family, and what she knew about her husband's kidnapping. Anne's letter to Governor Hunt said, in part, "Your memorialist states that in 1841 she received information by a letter directed to Henry B. Northup and postmarked at New Orleans that Solomon had been kidnapped in Washington, put on board a vessel, and was then in New Orleans, but could not tell his destination. Your memorialist has been wholly unable to obtain information of where Solomon was until September last, when another letter was received from Solomon, postmarked at Marksville, Louisiana, stating that he was held as a slave. The said Solomon is a free citizen of the state of New York and is now wrongfully held in slavery in or near Marksville, Louisiana. Anne Northup, November 19, 1852." In kidnapping cases, the governor was expected to name an agent to handle the matter. On November 23, 1852, Governor Hunt appointed Henry B. Northup special agent in the Solomon Northup case, but Henry had trouble getting away because he was locked in a close election for a U.S. Congress seat that, fortunately for Solomon, he ultimately lost. Not until December did Henry B. Northup pack up his clothes, law books and papers, and board a steamboat to begin the long journey to Marksville. Once there, he met with longtime Marksville lawyer and state senator John P. Waddell. After studying Henry B. Northup's documents, Waddell agreed that Solomon had been wrongfully enslaved. He even offered to help Northup free Solomon. Pierre Soule, a U.S. Senator from Marksville, also became deeply involved in the case and urged that Solomon be set free. The same was true of Louisiana politician Charles McGill Conrad, who had been United States Secretary of War. It may seem odd that these and other Louisiana lawmakers wholeheartedly agreed that Solomon had been wrongfully enslaved and should be allowed to return home to New York. Henry B. Northup was probably surprised by how agreeable they were. At this time, Northerners and Southerners were arguing bitterly about slavery. Louisiana officials wanted to show the world, especially anti-slavery Northerners, that they were law-abiding and fair. In return, they expected Northerners to respect their right to own slaves, which was legal in the Southern states. But Solomon Northup couldn't be freed if he couldn't be found. Where was he? The letter to the two store owners revealed that Solomon lived near Marksville, along Bayou Beth. That was a start, but neither John P. Waddell nor anyone else in Marksville knew of any slave in the area named Solomon Northup. Having delayed coming to Louisiana because of the election, Henry B. Northup was determined to make up for lost time by going to great lengths to find Solomon. He made plans to visit every plantation along Bayou Beth one at a time. Northup asked Waddell a question that had been puzzling him. Did he know anyone in or near Marksville who hated slavery enough to have written and mailed the letter for Solomon? Waddell said he knew just such a man. He is a generous, inoffensive man, but also always maintaining the wrong side of an argument. He is a carpenter. His name is Bass. Suddenly Waddell had an idea. He asked to see the letter to the two store owners once more and studied the top where it said, Bayou Beth, August 15th, 1852. The Marksville attorney asked an assistant in his law office if he knew where Samuel Bass had worked during the past summer. Somewhere on Bayou Beth was the answer. He is the man who can tell us about Solomon Northup, Waddell declared. Henry B. Northup hired a carriage, and on New Year's Day of 1853 he traveled a few miles to a settlement on the Red River where Samuel Bass was working. He found Bass, who agreed to speak with him privately. When the visitor introduced himself as Henry B. Northup from New York, Bass could hardly contain his joy, for that name had often been mentioned to him as an acquaintance of Solomon's. "Mr. Bass," said the lawyer from New York, "allow me to ask you if you were on Bayou Beth last August?" "Yes, sir, I was there," Bass admitted. "Did you write a letter for a colored man to some gentleman in Saratoga Springs?" continued Henry B. Northup. Bass wasn't ready to reveal that information until he knew a little more about the visitor. "Excuse me, sir, if I say that is none of your business." Mr. Northup then explained that he had come all the way from New York to free a black man named Solomon Northup, who had been kidnapped into slavery. A letter dated August 15th and postmarked at Marksville, Louisiana, had drawn him to this area. Convinced that Henry B. Northup was telling the truth, Samuel Bass told him everything he wanted to know. "I am the man who wrote the letter. If you have come to rescue Solomon Northup, I am glad to see you." "When did you last see him, and where is he?" Mr. Northup asked. "I last saw him Christmas, a week ago today," Bass answered. The carpenter then revealed the information that Henry B. Northup had traveled 1,500 miles to hear. He is the slave of Edwin Epps, a planter on Bayou Beth near Holmesville. He is not known as Solomon Northup. He is called Platt. Samuel Bass even drew a map for Henry B. Northup, showing Epps's plantation and the roads by which it could be reached. Edwin Epps could be expected to fight to keep a valuable property like Solomon Northup from being taken from him. To prevent that, and to make absolutely certain that Solomon had been wrongfully enslaved, the local sheriff accompanied Henry B. Northup to the Epps plantation. They arrived by carriage on the morning of January 3rd, 1853, just after Epps went inside to get his whip. Solomon watched as the two white men approached through the cotton field. Like the other shivering slaves, he wondered who the two visitors were. Identifying himself as the sheriff, one of the white men asked, Where's the boy they call Platt?" Solomon stepped forward, and the sheriff began questioning him. "Have you any other name than Platt?" "Solomon Northup is my name," he answered. "What was his wife's name? Where had their marriage taken place? How many children did they have, and what were their names?" Solomon answered the sheriff's questions correctly. "Do you know that man?" asked the sheriff, pointing to his companion in the tall hat and suit. Although the gentleman looked vaguely familiar, Solomon couldn't identify him at first. Then suddenly he knew. Henry B. Northup! Thank God! Thank God! Solomon was so excited that he could not say another word for quite a while. Bursting into tears, he clasped Henry B. by both hands and wouldn't let go. "Saul," said his old acquaintance from New York, "throw down that sack. Your cotton-picking days are over. Come with us to the man you live with." As they walked towards the Epps house, Solomon suddenly felt faint and had to be held up by the sheriff and Mr. Northup. Epps met the three men outside his home and invited them inside. When he learned that he was about to lose a slave for whom he had paid $1,500, he went into a rage. "You damned N!" Epps yelled. "Why did you not tell me you were free when I bought you?" "Master Epps," Solomon answered, "you did not take the trouble to ask me. Besides, I told one of my owners that I was free, and was whipped almost to death for it." Solomon later said that he would have given Epps a parting kick if it wouldn't have jeopardized his rescue from bondage. Epps then demanded that Solomon name the man who had mailed the letter at Marksville for him, but he refused. As Epps cursed and threatened to kill both Solomon and whoever had helped him, Henry B. Northup and the sheriff said it was time to depart. Edwin Epps wasn't about to give Solomon up without a legal struggle, though. He ordered his slave Bob to saddle his horse. Then off Epps galloped to the office of H. Taylor, his lawyer, to see if anything could be done to keep him from losing Platt. Meanwhile, with Epps gone and Solomon preparing to leave with the sheriff and Henry B. Northup, Solomon's fellow slaves in the cotton field came up to him to say farewell. Phoebe went first, whispering in his ear, "Wish I could go too, Platt." Old Abram and Bob also came to say goodbye. So did Mrs. Epps, who remarked that now there was no one to play the violin for her. But the person who was moved the most by Solomon's departure was Patsy, who threw her arms around his neck and said, "You're goin' way off yonder, where we'll never see you any more. You've saved me a good many whippin's, Platt. I'm glad you're goin' to be free, but oh God, what will become of me?" Solomon boarded the carriage with the sheriff and Northup. With a crack of the driver's whip, off they went. They were pulling out of the Epps plantation when Solomon glanced back and saw Patsy watching forlornly with the others. He waved at them, but just then the carriage rounded a bend and they were gone from his view forever. Solomon hoped to head back to New York immediately, but Henry B. explained that one more hurdle remained. The next day there was to be a big legal meeting in Marksville, at which Solomon would be officially freed from bondage. It was just a formality, Henry B. explained, but despite the reassurances, Solomon knew that Epps was determined to keep him as a slave. Until he actually stood on free soil, Solomon couldn't rest easy. The following morning, January 4th, 1853, Solomon attended the legal meeting. Participants included a judge and the sheriff, Henry B. Northup, John P. Waddle, and Epps and his lawyer, H. Taylor. Everything went as smoothly as Henry B. Northup had promised. Henry B. presented some legal papers. The sheriff related his conversation with Solomon in the cotton field and then questioned him further. Finally, lawyer Taylor explained that he had studied the case extensively and had concluded that Epps should sign a paper acknowledging that Solomon was entitled to his freedom. The moment Edwin Epps signed his name to the document, Solomon Northup was free after 12 years of bondage. Once the meeting ended, the two Northups began the long trip home. They hurried to the landing along the Red River and boarded a steamboat that took them to New Orleans. While there, Henry B. Northup wanted to meet Theophilus Freeman, the slave dealer in whose pen Solomon had been held. Henry hoped to determine whether Freeman should be prosecuted for knowingly selling a free black man. The two Northups entered the very room where William Ford had purchased Solomon 12 years earlier. They soon gave up the idea of prosecuting Freeman, however. He no longer owned the slave pen, and when seen on the streets of New Orleans, he struck Solomon as a low, miserable, broken down man. After 2 days in New Orleans, the two Northups headed north by railroad and steamboat. They made their way up the East Coast through the Carolinas and Virginia, and on January 17, 1853, after nearly 2 weeks of travel, they arrived in Washington, D.C. Henry B. Northup insisted that they spend a few days in the nation's capital because he felt that James Birch should be punished for knowingly buying a free black man from Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton and then selling him as a slave. Birch still lived in Washington, D.C., and Henry B. Northup had no trouble getting him arrested and quickly brought to trial. Proving Birch's guilt was another matter. He denied knowing that Solomon was a free man and had several friends testify on his behalf. Solomon wasn't allowed to present evidence against Birch because at that time black people weren't permitted to testify against whites in the courts of our nation's capital. Despite being under oath to tell the truth, Birch concocted an outrageous story. Instead of being the victim, Birch claimed, Solomon was the guilty party. He had pretended to be a slave so that he and his two partners in crime, Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton, could make a fortune. In other words, Solomon had been part of a scheme to sell himself into slavery. Since Solomon was not allowed to refute this lie, the judge didn't know what to think. He ruled that there was not enough evidence to convict Birch of buying and selling a man he knew to be free. James Birch was found not guilty of all charges and released from custody. Despite feeling bitter disappointment at the verdict, Solomon was grateful that Birch's trial had at least been quick. After just 3 days in Washington, D.C., the Northups resumed their journey on January 20th. As they continued northward by train and carriage, Solomon's heart beat faster with each passing mile. Soon he would be with his family. On Sunday morning, January 23, 1853, Solomon knocked on the front door of a cottage in Glens Falls, New York. A young woman with a little boy at her side answered the door. For a few seconds they stared at each other, the man thinking he was at the wrong house, the young woman wondering whether she had opened her door to a stranger. Then Solomon realized that the woman was his younger daughter, Margaret, who had been just 7 years old when he had last seen her. At the same time, Margaret realized that this vaguely familiar, middle-aged man was her long-lost father. Moments later, Solomon's older daughter, Elizabeth, entered the room. Close at her heels was Solomon's wife, Anne. They embraced me, Solomon later recalled, and with tears flowing down their cheeks, hung upon my neck. When our emotions subsided, the household gathered round the fire. We conversed of the thousands of events that had occurred, the hopes and fears, the joys and sorrows, the trials and troubles we had each experienced during the long separation. Solomon was saddened to learn that his mother had died in his absence. His son, Alonzo, was well, but was in the western part of New York, raising funds to buy his father out of slavery, if nothing else worked. The young boy at Margaret's side was Solomon Northup Staunton, named for the grandfather he had never before seen. People in and around Glens Falls, Saratoga Springs, and Sandy Hill, New York, were familiar with Solomon's story and were eager to see him. A huge reception in Solomon's honor was held at Sandy Hill just a day after his arrival. One of the event's organizers was David Wilson, a lawyer and former superintendent of area schools who also wrote books on local history. Speaking privately to Solomon, Wilson confided to him his belief that the public would enjoy reading about his experiences in slavery. Solomon accepted Wilson's offer to help him write his autobiography. Solomon wrote a description of his life as a slave. Wilson transformed the raw notes into a book. Working furiously, the two men completed Solomon's 336-page autobiography in only 3 months. The book was published that July by Derby and Miller, a firm based in Auburn, New York. It was given the cumbersome title, 12 Years a Slave, Narrative of Solomon Northup, a citizen of New York, kidnapped in Washington City in 1841 and rescued in 1853 from a cotton plantation near the Red River in Louisiana. 12 Years a Slave was a rousing success. Reviewers lavished praise upon Solomon's book. For example, the Syracuse Journal called it one of the most effective books against slavery that was ever written. The New York Tribune declared no one can contemplate the book without a new conviction of the hideousness of slavery. The New York Evangelist boldly predicted that 12 Years a Slave would increase the anti-slavery sentiment of the country. The glowing reviews boosted the book's sales. It sold 8,000 copies the first month, which was quite a start. By 1856, when publication of Solomon's original book came to a halt, it had sold more than 30,000 copies. That was a big number for the 1850s and would be an excellent total for a nonfiction book even today. Chapter 10. I had been restored to happiness and liberty. Among the readers of 12 Years a Slave was a judge from Fonda, New York, 50 miles from Solomon's home in Glens Falls. His name was Thaddeus St. John. When Judge St. John read how Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton sold Solomon into slavery in Washington, D.C. in 1841, he was reminded of an experience of his own at that very time. While stopping in Baltimore during a trip to Washington, D.C., St. John had run into two acquaintances from New York State, Alexander Merrill and Joseph Russell, who were accompanied by a black man. "What are you doing here, Joe?" St. John asked Russell. Seemingly upset about being recognized, Russell and Merrill rushed up to St. John and requested that he not call them by their real names. Judge St. John considered that mighty odd. Merrill and Russell soon displayed even more bizarre behavior. On the eve of President William Henry Harrison's funeral procession, St. John met the same three men at Gadsby's Hotel in Washington, D.C. He wasn't sure what the black man was doing with them, but his impression was that he was not a slave. Then, on his return trip to New York, St. John once again ran into Merrill and Russell in Baltimore. This time the black man was not with them. Apparently, having suddenly struck it rich, Merrill and Russell sported expensive new clothing, along with gold watches and fancy canes. St. John, half kidding, accused them of selling their black companion and remarked that they must have gotten $500 for him. To the judge's surprise, Merrill bragged that they had sold him for $150 more than that. Judge St. John assumed they were joking, for selling a free black man as their companion had appeared to be was a serious crime. When St. John questioned them further, the two white men said they were just pulling his leg. They had actually made a fortune, or so they claimed, by gambling with several Southern gentlemen. Reading about how the two circus men had sold Solomon Northup, Thaddeus St. John began to think that his two acquaintances were the guilty parties. After finishing 12 Years a Slave, St. John wrote to Solomon and arranged to meet him in Fonda. Despite the passage of time, Thaddeus St. John and Solomon Northup recognized one another instantly. Solomon was the black man St. John had seen with Alexander Merrill and Joseph Russell. Evidently, St. John's two acquaintances really had sold Solomon Northup into slavery. Solomon contacted Henry B. Northup and informed him that he had discovered the true identities of the two men who had lured him to Washington, D.C., and then sold him to Birch. Doing a little detective work, the two Northups learned that Alexander Merrill, alias Merrill Brown, was from Gloversville, New York, just 30 miles from where Solomon and his family had lived in Saratoga Springs. On the 4th of July, 1854, Alexander Merrill visited Gloversville to enjoy the holiday festivities at his parents' home. The two Northups aided the police in seizing Merrill, as described a few days later in the Albany Evening Journal. Henry B. Northup had spent a great deal of time and money ferreting out the scoundrel, and they have no doubt got the man. Solomon identifies him without a doubt. Merrill has long been regarded as a desperate fellow. They found him asleep with a heavy bowie knife and a brace of pistols on the floor by his side. Bulletins circulated alerting police to be on the lookout for Joseph Russell, alias Abram Hamilton, the other man wanted for selling Solomon Northup into slavery. Shortly after Merrill was captured, two police officers found Russell working as a boat captain on New York's Erie Canal. They arrested Russell, who along with his partner Merrill was jailed in a town a few miles from Saratoga Springs. Pending their trial, Russell and Merrill were each released on $5,000 bail, equal today to about $125,000. Russell and Merrill's trial for kidnapping and enslaving Solomon Northup opened in February 1855. The courtroom was packed, for Solomon's book had made the case famous. As part of Russell and Merrill's defense, slave dealer James Birch sent a statement to the court from Washington, D.C. It repeated Birch's lie from his own trial that Solomon had been part of his scheme to sell himself into slavery. Birch added an extra touch this time, saying that Solomon wanted to be enslaved so badly that he played on a borrowed fiddle in the Washington, D.C. slave pen to prove his value. Countering Birch's story was Thaddeus St. John, who testified that he had seen Solomon with Russell and Merrill in Washington, D.C. St. John also repeated what Merrill had told him in Baltimore, that he and Russell had sold Solomon for $650. Once again, enough doubt was cast on what had occurred that the defendants avoided a guilty verdict. Merrill and Russell, like Birch, were never punished for their crimes against Solomon Northup. Yet despite not seeing justice done in his case, Solomon had regained what he treasured most, his freedom and his family. Solomon received a $3,000 payment for the publication of his book, equal to around $75,000 today. He spent some of the money on a piece of land in Glens Falls, next to the cottage where his married daughter Margaret lived with her husband and their child. Evidently, Solomon planned to build a home for Anne and himself on the property, but he never did. Instead, he and Anne remained in Margaret's house. To earn a living, Solomon worked as a carpenter. From time to time, he also went on the road giving talks about his 12 years as a slave. Samuel Bass had once told Solomon, "If I can succeed in getting you away from here, it will be a good act that I shall like to think of all of my life." Had he lived a little longer, Bass might have visited Solomon and his family, but the man who had done so much to rescue Solomon from slavery became ill with pneumonia just a few months after Solomon's return to New York State. In the summer of 1853, while still in Louisiana, Samuel Bass died at the age of only about 48. It is unknown whether Edwin Epps ever discovered that Bass sent the letters that helped free Solomon. Around 1860, when he was in his early 50s, Solomon Northup disappeared from view. "We simply don't know what became of him," explains Renee Moore, who in 1999 founded an annual event in Saratoga Springs called Solomon Northup Day, a celebration of freedom. He may have died of natural causes somewhere. Another guess is that he may have been killed by his abductors as he traveled about speaking about his ordeal and his autobiography. Thus far, his final resting place has not been determined. These few words by Solomon at the end of 12 Years a Slave regarding his return home are a fitting memorial to him. My heart overflowed as I looked upon old familiar scenes and found myself in the midst of friends of other days. I had been restored to happiness and liberty. Afterward. From 1780 to the early 1860s, large numbers of slaves won their freedom, becoming known as free blacks or free persons of color. Escaping to the northern states and Canada was the most common way that slaves achieved their liberty. At least 50,000 slaves escaped by following the North Star to freedom. Strange but true, another way that slaves won their freedom was by buying themselves. Slaves typically had one day of the week off, Sunday. By running errands and doing other tasks on Sundays, slaves were paid nickels and dimes and tips. After decades of earning small change, some slaves saved enough Sunday money to purchase and free themselves. Often, as their own lives drew to a close, slaveholders realized that slavery was evil. Some wrote out wills that would free their slaves of a certain date. For example, according to George Washington's will, his slaves were to be set free after he and his wife Martha died. While it is well known that many African Americans went from slavery to freedom, it is less known that thousands of black people went from freedom to slavery, mainly by being kidnapped like Solomon Northup. How many thousands suffered this fate is unknown because no records were kept chronicling all the free blacks who were enslaved. The laws in the South actually encouraged the enslavement of free black people. One of the rules of law in the U.S. is that a person is presumed innocent until proven guilty. But in the South, in slavery days, black people walking along a road or through a town were presumed to be runaway slaves and were arrested and jailed. The burden was upon them to prove that they were free. To make things worse, in most of the South, African Americans who were jailed for any reason whatsoever were required to pay their jail and court costs. Those who lacked the money could be sold into bondage to pay the bills. The result was the enslavement of many free black people. Another unjust law that was widespread in both the South and the North barred free black people from testifying in court. This meant that they had to sit silently at trials while fake evidence was brought forth identifying them as slaves. Of course, slavery of any kind is evil, but famed African American leader Frederick Douglass, himself a runaway slave, felt that there was something especially awful about the enslavement of free people like Solomon Northup. In 1853, Douglass wrote about Solomon, "Think of it. For 30 years a man with all a man's hopes, fears, and aspirations, with a wife and children to call him husband and father, with a home, humble it may be. Then for 12 years a thing, classed with mules and horses, torn from his home and family, and driven to toil in a cotton field by the lash of an inhuman master. Oh, it is horrible. It chills the blood." The enslavement of free blacks lasted until 1865, the year slavery was abolished in the United States by the North's victory in the Civil War. Then all the remaining Solomon Northups and all the other slaves like Patsy, old Abram, Wiley, and Eliza and her children were forever released from bondage.